Her white tail coiled tight around her shins as if it could make her smaller, as if vanishing were safer than being seen. And the whisper that slipped out of her lips was a secret she'd carried for too long, that no one would ever pick me. Not really. Not when I look like this. And Jace Marlowe only crouched to bring his steady gaze level with hers, answering with the kind of certainty that fixes broken elevators and stubborn hearts alike. That anyone who wouldn't choose you is a fool, because I already have. And the city breathed neon through the window while the healer's apprentice with the snow pail pelt hugged a frayed satchel to her chest, unsure whether to cross a threshold that felt too generous to belong to her. The spare room behind Jace hardly more than a nook, the kitchen narrow as a train car, the whole place a square of concrete and light. Yet somehow it felt like shelter, like a landing strip cut out of a storm. And when Sira Valine finally stepped over the line, tail tucked close, ears tipped low, she moved with the quiet of falling ash, apologizing for the space she took, for the heat in the pipes, for the breath in her lungs, while he shook his head each time and said, "You live here," which meant more to her than he knew. Jace had seen Volpines before, street bright in ember reds and copper gold, even a sleek midnight coat that looked poured from smoke. But he had never seen white like this, not chalk, not cream, but starlight distilled into fur, each strand catching the alley glow and throwing it back in a hush. And he watched how Sira folded herself small, how she carried the knowledge of eyes on her body like a weight, how every step sought permission from the floorboards. And he thought of how a city can forget to be gentle, how people decide what's desirable by habit rather than truth. And he decided that in this apartment at least, the rules would be different, because he needed little in life: coffee in a clean mug, a corner for books, a couch that didn't complain, 6 hours without alarms. But he found he liked the soft new sound of another presence, liked the way quiet wasn't empty anymore. And when he told her the bedroom was hers, he meant it, even when she tried to barter herself into the couch with another sorry. And he just said, "Take it, I'm fine," because he was, and because the steadiness in his voice seemed to be the only thing that loosened her breath. The first week wrote itself in careful lines, a slow-burn routine that felt like learning a language by ear. Sira gliding barefoot across the floor with a shadow's restraint, her tail snug around her legs whenever she wasn't moving, as if she still expected a door to slam. And when she clipped a chair and flinched like she'd broken a law, Jace only tapped the backrest with a knuckle and said, "This thing has done worse to me than you ever could," then smiled until her shoulders unhooked. And on a night when the rain stitched the windows, he came home to find a table laid with heroic effort, mismatched bowls, a trio of stub candles, and a pot steaming with an aroma that couldn't decide if it belonged in a bakery or a scrapyard. And she murmured that humans share meals with friends, and he lifted a spoon like it was ceremony, eating until she took the first bite. And when her ears folded in alarm, he said, "It's good," with the calm of a man who knows how to hold a line, and the tiny smile that unfurled on her face was worth more than the best stew in the district. So he would have eaten ash and gravel if it meant seeing it again. Outside, Oraline never missed a chance to stare, not the way cruelty looks, but the way novelty does. Yet novelty can scrape like sand when it never stops. And at the market he shouldered through halls of steam and barter with Sira half a step behind, the vendors a chorus of scales and feathers and skin, and still the glances found them, especially her, a white glow pelt against the riot of color, the Avens tilting their sleek heads, a pair of human teens whispering behind sugar steam, a russet Volpine frowning as if he'd misplaced a rule. And Jace felt the way Sira's ears angled down, the way her tail tightened as though warding herself. So he stepped closer until his presence cast like a shield, telling her in a tone that held, "They stare because they've never seen a winter star this near, not because you're less." And back home he found her perched on the couch's edge, staring at her hands with the stillness of someone bracing for a verdict that came before she was born, murmuring that her people's looks weren't curiosity but censure, that brightness meant worthy and white meant nothing. And he set tea by her fingers and said, "Their meter is wrong, not you." Then let the quiet do its work around them until he heard her breathe again. By the second week, the apartment had learned her shape, not loud, not obvious, but in graces that only patience notices: a paper flower by the sink, laundry folded to precise edges on his chair, a kettle already singing when his late shift spit him home, And he realized it wasn't just math, not a bed traded for a bed, not spare room for coin, but a warmth that made his books read easier, a light that made his coffee taste truer, and he noticed micro things about her, how the faint broom stroke of her tail along would become a metronome of peace, how she followed him from room to room the way a moon follows tide, sitting cross-legged nearby with a text floating in her wristband whenever he tuned a vent or tightened a panel. And when he told her, "You don't have to haunt the air, you can talk," she lifted her gaze like a window cracked an inch, admitting she liked being near him because it felt safe. And he said, "Then keep doing it," with a shrug that meant permission stitched into place, and her smile had edges of relief that he wanted to guard like a small fire in wind. Her efforts to speak fluent human were a collection of endearing misfires that somehow always landed in the right country, even when the road was crooked, like the afternoon she arrayed a bouquet of market-bright blossoms in a drinking glass, apologizing that she didn't own a proper vase, and Jace slid a stem into place and declared it perfect because care, not container, was the point. Or the night she undertook a kitchen siege that left flour footprints and open spice packets like confetti, while a pot threatened mutiny, and he ladled the brave stew with the stoicism of a saint until she tasted it and winced, and he admitted maybe it needs another chapter while eating another spoon anyway, and she laughed, that shy, surprised sound that seemed to light something inside her chest, and he realized that what mattered wasn't whether the sauce stuck, it was how she gifted him pieces of herself in these attempts. A ribbon he didn't need, a sweet he could have gone without, each gesture offered with a flinch like she still expected refusal, and each time he met the gift with thanks and the giver with steadiness until the flinch softened into a question that wanted a yes. Laid on a balcony smelling of rain and transit, he asked the why as gentle as one can turn a locked bolt, why she waited for him to say no even to harmless things, and Syrah said because most people do, the word small but honed by years, and he answered I'm not most with a matter-of-factness that made the city hum feel like consent. And over the month he discovered he was watching her more than the news tick. Not because she demanded attention, but because she carried it like a quiet magnet. The way her fur caught light like frost and dawn. The way confidence stole onto her face when she forgot to shrink. The way her relief exhaled when he said you're fine. Stay as if approval were medicine. And Jace, who was used to solving problems that sparked and leaked, realized the problem he couldn't fix with tools was the one occurring in his chest. An accumulation like snowfall, a feeling drifting down, without drama until it was everywhere, until he looked up and saw his world quieter and truer because she was in it. When he came home to find Syrah studying a cultural primer, the hollow paging through diagrams of customs and kinship, he teased her for doing homework on humanity, and she said she wanted to understand what mattered to his people, for him, not as payment, but as care, and he told her then I'll trade you. I'll learn Vulpine ways if we're sharing rent and moonlight, because it seems right to honor your language, too. And she stared as if no one had ever offered to meet her halfway, ears lifting in a startle that looked like hope learning to walk. And the next day, she brewed something bitter earthy and steeped with floating petals, a sharing tea from her side of the river. And when she tried to apologize for the taste, he cut through with it's good enough to be ours, which wasn't about flavor so much as belonging. And that night, when a hollow flicker painted the room soft, she nodded off onto his shoulder, and he didn't move, both because he liked the weight and because he was afraid the spell had a clause that said, "Don't breathe too loud." And when she started awake in alarm, he anchored her with a palm on her shoulder and said it's fine with the kind of gravity that rewrites a rulebook. Eventually, he saw the signs of a thought she didn't want to say, the way her eyes went far while the book stayed open, the telltale curl of tail that meant bracing. And when he asked what weight she was carrying, Syrah told him about the older Vulpine at the market who had looked at her like she was a smudge on a mirror, an embarrassment to be wiped off rather than a person to greet. And she explained how color in her culture was not just fashion but destiny, how radiance meant chosen and white meant overlooked, how elders said plain as if it were a kindness. And Jace felt the heat in his jaw even as his voice stayed even, answering that a rule is not a law of nature. It's a habit with lobbyists, and his habit would never be measuring worth by hue. And when she whispered no one would ever choose me with the kind of quiet that makes a room hold its breath, he leaned forward and met her gaze head on, saying then we'll draft a better custom, because I would, right now, without blinking. And he wasn't dressing the sentence in flowers. He was laying it like tile, square and true, and the shock that flickered through her golden eyes was a sunrise trying the window for the first time. After that night, something fundamental ticked over, not with fanfare but with the certainty of a latch finding its catch. And while Sierra didn't stop being shy, didn't stop apologizing by reflex, she started leaving a cup by his hand without asking, started waiting up when he ran late even though he told her she didn't have to, started meeting his return with a smile that looked like the beginning of ease. And one evening, she asked him if humans cared about color when choosing someone, tripping over words as if she feared the answer might close a door. And he told her people notice, sure, but they stay for who you are, not for palettes. And if a human saw white fur, they'd probably stare because it was rare enough to remember, not because it was an absence. And the faint flick of her tail gave away a feeling she was still teaching herself to trust. And later, staring into a dark that no longer felt empty, Jace acknowledged to himself what he had been avoiding on purpose, that he wanted her here not because spare rooms should be full, not because rent liked company, but because she was Sierra, and he had come to expect the world to feel better when she was near. On a night when rain whispered against the glass like an old confidant, he stumbled in from a soaked shift repairing an elevator that thought gravity was optional, and he found her awake and waiting, pelt catching lamplight like frost on wire. And when she said she wanted to know he'd returned safely, something in his chest gave up, pretending it wasn't moved. So he slouched into the chair across from hers and told her she didn't need to stay up. And she answered that she wanted to, not as obligation but as choice. And when she finally admitted she'd overheard two healers wondering why anyone would mentor a white-furred apprentice, why patients should have to stare at someone unlucky, the old anger rose again, and he caged it with calm, not because he was indifferent, but because he wanted his words to land. And he told her their beliefs were mud on fine boots, everywhere, but not worth the respect they demanded. Then he stopped circling and said the word he'd been avoiding the way. A proud man avoids asking for help, calling her beautiful like it was a fact he was tired of leaving unsaid. And she flushed so quickly it looked like light underwater, ears trembling in the tug-of-war between disbelief and hope. And he added, "I don't bluff," which in his mouth meant oath more than boast. And the purr that started in her chest was so soft he felt it against the air rather than heard it with ears. Days after, Jace caught a new itch under his skin, not the kind that sends you searching for a wrench, but the kind that says you owe a gesture measured in their language rather than yours, because Sierra had crossed the river to him again and again with flowers and drinking glasses and brave disasters of dinner and an openness he recognized as risk. So he spent a lunch hour reading about vulpine courtship with a frown that said he was taking notes, meeting customs named for small sacred things, tokens of feather and polished stone, herbs arranged as promises, nesting spaces made together. And he thought how human romance often hid under lights and strings while hers announced itself with tactile vows. And he decided to try even if he'd do it clumsily. So that evening he left a bundle on the table, a few city-plucked feathers tied with cord, imperfect and sincere. And when Sierra saw it, she startled like the ground had shifted underfoot, fingers hovering as if touching might ruin it. Then lifting it to her chest with tears that glimmered at the edges like dew, asking if he'd made this for her as though the answer might break her. And he told her yes, not sure whether he'd gotten it right, but sure it was hers. And she said no one had ever offered her one. And he steadied her shoulders and replied, "Then everyone else has been wrong about what you deserve." That night, she slept with the feathers tucked beneath her palm like a heartbeat, tail looped warm around his waist, as if to anchor the room to the bed. And he lay awake longer than he planned, counting not the steps to tomorrow, but the ways this felt like building rather than borrowing. And he thought about how rituals become real when you mean them, how a stew eaten from one bowl can speak a promise louder than plated courses. So the next evening he cleared the table, cooked something honest and hot, set 2 spoons by one steaming pot. And when Sierra came home, she stared at the arrangement with that reverence she reserved for moments that felt like firsts, sitting carefully, purring without permission the instant the taste hit. And he ate with his usual unhurried patience, saying little because happiness doesn't require narration. And later the lamps threw city color across the couch, while she combed her tail with long, slow strokes that looked like preparing to say a thing and then deciding not to. And he remembered what he'd read about grooming, about how a vulpine offers that intimacy only to a chosen partner, how it is not just affection, but vow. And his pulse ticked faster for the first time in days, not because of fear, but because meaning was a high wire. And yet he lifted his hand and slid his fingers through her white hair with the caution of touching a star, telling her to breathe, telling himself not to rush, letting each stroke be as deliberate as a signature. And Sira trembled and leaned into it, her purr deepening, her ears shivering under his fingertips, the trust of it heavier than any lace could be, the room full of a quiet that felt like a promise still being written. The first pass of his fingers through her hair felt like stepping onto a bridge that neither of them had known how to build, the motion unhurried and careful, tracing from crown to nape with a steadiness that matched the way Jace fixed anything that mattered. And Sira leaned into the touch as if gravity had shifted its loyalties, the soft sound in her chest deepening until the room itself seemed to hum along. Neon slanting through the blinds in quiet bars of color while the city murmured its late-hour secrets. And he learned the topography of her calm with each slow stroke, the way her ears tipped to meet his hand, the way tension unspooled across her shoulders, the way she breathed fuller by degrees, admitting without words that closeness could be shelter rather than test. And when he paused to ask if this was all right, she nodded with that shining, uncertain bravery he had come to recognize, whispering that no one had ever offered tenderness in her language before and that she didn't know how to hold it yet, only that she wanted to try. They did not hurry the next days, as if time were something they could need until it softened, the apartment learning their new rhythm while the outside world kept its old arguments. And Sira left for the healer's hall with a straighter line to her spine and returned with stories that were half exhaustion, half small triumphs, describing the old engineer whose pulse calmed when she spoke softly, the toddler who laughed when her tail flicked like a metronome, the senior mentor who watched, without praise or censure, as if waiting to decide which narrative to believe, while Jace brought home the grit of elevator shafts and the heavy smell of coolant, trading reports about stubborn machinery and stubborn people over a shared bowl, their spoons clinking like punctuation. And at night, she read aloud from the primer they'd started, stopping to ask about idioms that made no sense, and smiling when he explained. And he asked his own questions in return about Vulpine proverbs that sounded like maps to weather, and in the telling they realized that understanding is less a lesson than a series of permissions granted in both directions. Word traveled the market in the way rumors do, not fast or slow, but inevitable. And one afternoon a cluster of young Vulpines drifted too close to the produce stall where Sira compared herbs, their coats bright with ember and bronze, and the easy confidence of those who have always matched the poster on the wall. And the remarks arrived with sweet voices and sharp edges. Nothing named, but everything meant. What a mercy to have worked despite appearances. What a curiosity that someone would house snow when the city needed fire. And Jace stepped in as if his body had remembered a promise before his mouth could make one. Not confrontational, only present, the kind of presence that changes the shape of a doorway. And he thanked the vendor for the coriander and asked Sira if she'd help him carry the bag. Not because he needed the help, but because partnership can be a shield without becoming a spectacle. And when they were 2 alleys away and her tail had loosened again, he said that he would walk beside her in any street she chose without flinching. Not because she required protection, but because he preferred the world where she wasn't made to walk alone, a distinction she absorbed like heat on a cold morning. Back home, he left a second token on the table, a palm-sized river stone polished by decades of city runoff until it shone like a kept secret, the surface etched with a clumsy swirl he'd scratched using a file at work, and Sira touched it with reverence that made him want to apologize for every imperfection. But she said the spiral meant continuity in old Vulpine pattern speech, meaning not just I choose you now, but I will keep choosing you when the light changes. And she wrapped the stone in a strip of blue cloth from a worn shawl, binding it with the feather bundle as if weaving their days into a single object. And later she showed him a short greeting gesture used only in private, a light tap of foreheads that acknowledged both difference and closeness at once. And when they tried it, they both went still with surprise at how right it felt, as if some hinge had swung properly on its pin at last. The healer's hall remained a weather system she had to cross, shifting from drizzle to bright to sudden squalls, depending on which corridor she walked, and a senior practitioner with eyes like polished gold, Master Tareth, paused her in the dispensary one morning to say that punctuality and precision would earn her a place regardless of ornament, a sentence that did not praise her and yet did not erase her. And his measured neutrality proved to be a foothold she could use, so she stayed late too. Indexed tinctures, charted recovery curves with exacting care, and learned that when she led with competence, the arguments about color had fewer places to stand, though not none, while Jace discovered he had started carrying a small tin of salve in his jacket because he liked the way her face shifted from worry to amused scold when he admitted he'd scraped a knuckle. And she dabbed the ointment with gentle efficiency that made trouble seem solvable, which he, a man who solved problems for a living, found humbling in a way he did not resent. One night, when thunder stitched the skyline and the elevators in 3 towers conspired to misbehave at once, Jace dragged himself home at an hour that felt unclaimed by the clock, and Syrah was sitting cross-legged on the couch with the blue-wrapped bundle in her lap, as if guarding something they had both promised. And when he eased down beside her, she pressed the tokens into his hands and asked if he would hold them for a while, because they were heavy in the best way, and she wanted to feel what it was like to be the one at the center of a keeping rather than the edge of it. And he said of course, and tucked the bundle into the curve of his palm, and the quiet that settled made simple sense, like a tool returning to its hook, and the kiss that followed was unhurried and uncomplicated, carrying the taste of rain and the gentleness of 2 people who have learned the value of not rushing. And when they drew apart, there was no need to narrate what had changed, because change sometimes hums so plainly through a room that even the cups on the shelf seemed to notice. In the days that followed, they tested the edges of routine the way a craftsman tests a beam, not to find faults but to learn its strengths, and Jace started leaving handwritten notes in blocky letters where she would find them, a scribbled joke by the kettle, a reminder to eat something warm on the counter, a map of a short walking route with the quietest corners, and Syrah answered in neat, slanted script pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tiny wrench, promising to bring fresh bread, asking which spice went with which stew, drawing a fox with a comically serious expression beside the words rest, engineer, and the domestic ease grew like ivy, deliberate in its climb, and the building's old superintendent, who knew every story the pipes could tell, took Jace aside to say he seemed lighter these days, which made him consider how lightness is not the absence of weight, but the presence of someone willing to share it. And when he told Syrah this, she touched her forehead to his, with that small private greeting, and he understood that she had heard the compliment as belonging to them both. There were missteps, because learning each other is not the same as memorizing a book. And one Saturday Jace tried to surprise her by organizing the cupboard to what he imagined was optimal efficiency, stacking tins by size and lining herbs in strict alphabetical grids, only to find Syrah standing motionless at the threshold with a look that was not anger but a lostness he couldn't parse. And when he asked what he'd gotten wrong, she said with careful breath that in her childhood quarters she had survived by knowing precisely where her few belongings could hide without being noticed, that arrangement equaled safety, and that his well-meant order had erased the map she used to release fear, and he apologized without defense, sat with her on the floor, and together they put everything back where her hands remembered, while he learned a subtler truth about care, that it asks which maps a person trusts before redrawing the corridors, and she learned a subtler truth about love, that a mistake can be a kind of gift when it is followed by listening rather than pride. The first time Syrah visited Jace's job site, she stood at the base of a skeletal service tower where cables hung like the strings of an instrument and watched him move with the economy of someone whose mind had already walked the length of each bolt, and she asked a small forest of questions about counterweights and safety interlocks, about how he knew which hum meant danger and which hum meant good news, and he grinned in a way she'd rarely seen, a lopsided flash that confessed delight at being understood in his own dialect. And when the lift car finally obeyed and rose cleanly, the line of spectators on the adjacent platform actually clapped, city-weary and honest, and Syrah clapped too, not because she thought he needed applause, but because joy should be practiced out loud when it can be. And he looked over and found her watching him with a pride that didn't require proof. And for a flicker of a second, he felt as transparent as glass in sunlight, which was not uncomfortable so much as new. And on the walk home he told her he wanted to be worthy of how she looked at him, a sentence that felt less like aspiration and more like a vow. At the healer's hall, Master Tareth requested Syrah's help on a complex intake day when the sign-in board filled faster than hands could tree off, and she moved through a sequence of small, exact mercies. Cool cloth to fevered brow, compress wrapped with symmetrical patience, tone adjusted to the rhythm of a frightened breath, until the room itself began to align to her cadence, and afterward Tareth said, still not praising, that the work had gone smoother with her at the center of it, which Syrah held like a bead of amber she could keep in her pocket for later. And that night, she asked Jace what sort of recognition mattered most to him. The plaque on the breakroom wall, or the moment a stuck system sang back into motion. And he answered truthfully that the second always felt more honest, because the applause was nice but the returning hum meant the city could breathe again. And she nodded as if tucking the idea into her kit. And he realized that she had been building a shared language, not only of touch and tokens, but of values, and that their courtship was less a sequence of candles than a mutual apprenticeship in seeing what the other trusted. Their first real argument happened not about jealousy or money, but about future routes. A map unfolded on the table showing districts neither had lived in, but both had opinions about. Jace wanting a street with better sunlight for her plants. Syrah wanting proximity to a clinic that quietly accepted anyone regardless of insurance or species. Each of them arguing with that earnestness that comes from love rather than control. And when the heat in their voices cooled, they saw what had been true all along, that they were already planning decades without daring to admit it, that they were sketching a life as casually as people plan a weekend. And Syrah laughed an embarrassed, gorgeous laugh at the realization, while Jace rubbed a hand over his face and asked if they were getting ahead of themselves. And she said perhaps, but the map had looked lonely without our notes on it. And he couldn't argue with that because he had felt the same ache. And they decided to keep the open question open, to let time help draw the lines rather than pretend certainty they did not need in order to move forward hand in hand. Intimacy deepened in increments that valued consent like breath, and while there were nights when their kisses lengthened and their hands learned new paths across familiar terrain, they were careful to let meaning set the pace rather than wanting, the quiet between them as eloquent as anything spoken. And when Syrah asked with unsteady courage if grooming could be exchanged rather than bestowed, Jace nodded and sat cross-legged while she combed her fingers through his hair with an attention that made him feel both taller and more at rest, the reciprocal tenderness drawing a circle around them that felt ceremonial in the best sense. And they discovered that soft can be stronger than loud when it is consistent, that a steady yes over many evenings can build a foundation deeper than a single lightning strike. And the city, with all its sharp corners and negotiated mercies, seemed to hang back a little when they were together, as if giving them a pocket of gentler gravity in which to practice belonging until belonging no longer felt like practice at all. When Syrah's white coat drew fresh whispers at a public health drive, two volunteers debating within earshot whether a winter pelt sent the wrong message, she did not fold herself smaller as she once might have, because Jace's earlier words had started to live inside her bones, and instead she finished setting out bandages, then crossed to the table where the event coordinator stood, asking if they had ever considered featuring a poster of a frost fox herbalist from the southern provinces whose work had saved an entire watershed after a blight, and the coordinator blinked at the name and admitted they had not. But by week's end a new print hung on the clinic wall, pale fur luminous in painterly brushstrokes, and Syrah stood before it longer than she meant to, absorbing the simple power of seeing herself represented as more than an exception, while Jace, who had listened to the story that night with his chin on his palm, went out the next morning to a small art stall and found a postcard of the same image, taping it inside the cupboard door so she would see it every time she reached for tea, because some reminders should be private gifts rather than public announcements. The evening they finally invited the superintendent and two neighbors for stew to repay a dozen small kindnesses. Syrah almost backed out twice at the sound of footsteps in the hall, but Jace rested a hand over the blue-wrapped bundle where it lived at the center of the table and said that hospitality is just care with chairs, and the meal unfolded without incident, the conversation wobbling a bit at first and then finding its cadence. The older woman from down the hall telling a story about her late wife's legendary soups and how the recipe changed each season to honor whatever the market had, and the superintendent praising the repair on the lobby light that had stopped flickering after months of neglect, and Syrah noticing how easy it was to laugh when the laughter was an invitation rather than a test. And when the door closed behind their guest, she sagged against the table and whispered that she hadn't realized how starved she'd been for a night like this. Not grand, not miraculous, just kind. And Jace said that kindness is the miracle we can repeat on purpose. And they stood there for a long minute, letting that truth settle into the walls like warmth after a storm. On a quiet midnight that smelled of cinnamon and rain, Jace unfolded a cloth on the counter and revealed something he'd made in secret over weekend hours. A small wooden box fashioned from scrap paneling. The surface sanded until it felt like the inside of a well-used book cover. The lid inlaid with 3 narrow strips of metal scavenged from retired circuits. And he explained with an awkwardness she found endearing that he wanted a place for their tokens to live together when they weren't being held, not a shrine, just a home. And Syrah traced the inlay with a fingertip and understood immediately that the box was both container and promise, a way to keep choosing even when days got busy or moods turned gray. And she placed the feather bundle and the wrapped stone inside, then added a small twist of dried herb from her kit, the kind used to scent winter rooms, saying that the first lesson her gentlest teacher had given her was this: that care begins with making space for what you love to rest. And they left the lid open that night because the smell of the herb mingled with the faint metallic tang in a way that made the apartment feel like a workshop and a hearth at the same time. As the season tipped toward colder mornings, the city's light changed its angle and the market grew bristly with scarves and steam, and Syrah bought 2 plain mugs whose clay was flecked with mica so that they seemed to hold a star even when empty. One for him, one for her, no symbols printed on the sides, no jokes. Only the utility of warmth and the intention of a matched pair. And Jace responded by fixing the bulky radiator in the bedroom, not with a temporary shim, but with a full overhaul, crawling into the guts of it until the pipes exhaled evenly. And when the heat came up at last and her shoulders dropped in relief, he looked at her and realized that love, for him, would always sound like that sigh. The return of function, the proof that a small corner of the universe could be brought back into alignment. And she seemed to read the thought in his face because she rested her forehead to his again and murmured that she had finally learned what safety feels like from the inside. Which is to say, it feels like room to be quiet without fear, like warmth that doesn't demand a performance in exchange, like knowing someone will not leave just because the day has nothing spectacular to offer. They kept making small vows that would never show up on a license or a registry, the kind that accrue like interest in a reliable account. Walking routes memorized for the way they pass pocket gardens, grocery lists built to favor what is fresh and kind to the budget, weekly notes pinned by the wrench magnet titled "What I'm proud of you for this week," and they meant every line, which is the only magic praise really needs in order to work. And one evening Syrah arrived home to find 3 tiny origami cranes perched along the windowsill, paper folded from old work orders, each one inked with a word: steadfast, luminous, chosen. And she stood in the low light and let the tears come without shame because being chosen had become less a sentence someone said and more a daily fact she recognized in the way he looked up when she entered, the way he made space, the way he never asked her to be louder than she wanted to be. And Jace, drying his hands, watched her as if witnessing a sunrise he'd get to keep, understanding that the truest proof of love is not grand gesture, but consistent refuge offered and accepted until both people can rest with their whole weight. The first chill of early winter came not with snow, but with a kind of silence that settled over the city when people started walking faster between lights, their breath turning visible, their voices shorter. Inside the apartment, warmth lingered like a kept promise. The radiator's new rhythm made a soft percussion against the background hum, and Syrah had started spending more time by the window, watching the world turn gray and gold while tracing tiny hearts in the fog on the glass with the tip of her claw. She wasn't lonely now when Jace left for work. She'd found the courage to fill her hours with things that belonged to her alone, but she still counted the minutes until the sound of his key turned the lock, and every evening when he stepped inside with the smell of machinery and rain on his jacket, her tail would flick like the smallest sunrise, giving her away long before she spoke his name. He would laugh softly and tell her he was home as though that word were something they both had learned to redefine, not a location but a state that existed only when the other was near. It was around this time that Sira began dreaming again. Not the anxious dreams she used to have. The ones filled with mirrors that wouldn't show her reflection, but new ones. Dreams where she ran through a forest of pale trees, her fur glowing brighter with every step, never once looking back to see if someone was watching. She told Jace about them one morning over tea, her voice husky from sleep, admitting that they scared her a little because she couldn't remember ever running without fear before. Jace, half awake and half lost in her words, said maybe the forest wasn't trying to swallow her this time. Maybe it was opening to let her through, and she smiled at that, saying that if he kept interpreting her dreams like that, she might start believing them were omens of good instead of echoes of old wounds. He grinned and told her belief was a good kind of rebellion. From that morning on, whenever she left for work, he'd murmur, "Go run, white fox," under his breath, and she'd laugh without looking back, her tail flicking behind her like punctuation. At the healer's hall, change came quietly. Master Tareth, who rarely praised anyone directly, started assigning her to more complex cases, ones that required both knowledge and patience. When the head medic fell ill, Sira was asked to organize the apothecary for the week, and she worked late each night, aligning labels and adjusting ratios until her fingers cramped. The first day she left the hall past midnight, a courier stopped her in the corridor, a younger vulpine with cinnamon fur and wide, untested eyes. He hesitated before speaking, then blurted out that his sister had told him about the White One, who never made a mistake with dosages, that she'd saved his friend's child last week. Sira blinked, stunned, unsure whether to laugh or cry, but managed a quiet thank you before walking out into the chill night air, her breath clouding before her. She didn't tell Jace right away. She wanted to hold the words close for a while, to feel what it was like to be spoken of with respect instead of pity, but when she finally did, his only response was to cup her face gently and say, "That's the beginning of people learning how wrong they've been." Winter pressed closer, and with it came a kind of stillness that suited them. Jace's work slowed for a while as the city's construction sites froze under weather warnings. They spent more evenings inside, the world narrowing pleasantly to the size of their apartment, where the air smelled of tea and iron and faint traces of cinnamon from the herb Sira liked to burn. She'd started teaching him bits of her language, short phrases that couldn't be translated cleanly but carried the weight of layered feeling. One night, she told him the word Chilin, which meant not, "I love you exactly," but, "You are the part of the quiet I listen to." Jace tried repeating it, fumbling the consonants, making her laugh until she fell against his shoulder. He said if that was love in her tongue, then she'd already been saying it with every look, and she told him his version of romance was too pragmatic for poetry but worked just the same. When he kissed her after that, she whispered the word again, slower this time, until it melted into the space between them. By midwinter, their neighbors had grown used to seeing them together. The landlord joked about the white ghost keeping the old engineer in line, and Jace just grinned, saying he'd never been more haunted. One morning, a courier brought a package neither of them expected, a small wooden frame holding a certificate from the Healers' Council, an official commendation for exemplary service and compassion. Sira's hands shook as she read it, because it wasn't the paper that mattered but the seal at the bottom, the mark of the Vulpine Guild that had once turned her away for her color. They had to sign it, Jace said quietly, watching her expression change. "They couldn't ignore you anymore." She smiled, her eyes shining like frost-catching light, and said maybe it wasn't about them at all. Maybe it was about how she'd finally stopped asking for their permission to exist. He nodded and said that sounded like the kind of healing no hall could teach. Their love became something woven into the simplest acts, her bringing him a mug when his hands were too full of tools, him straightening her cloak before she left for work, both of them instinctively reaching for the other and passing like it was muscle memory. Sometimes they still fought, small things about leaving lights on or forgetting to eat, but their arguments never stayed sharp. Jace once said the trick wasn't never breaking. It was learning how to bend without shattering, and Sira said he sounded like a craftsman describing glass. On one of those colder nights, when power outages rolled through the district and the apartment went dark, they lit every candle they owned and sat wrapped together under a single blanket, her fur glowing like reflected moonlight. She told him that among her people, winter nights were for renewal rituals, moments to burn away the doubts of the old year, and asked if she could try one with him. He agreed without question, and she placed her hand against his chest, whispering words in her tongue that meant, "I release what hurt me, I keep what held me, and I choose this again." Then she looked at him and said, "Now you." He covered her hand with his own and repeated the words as best he could, stumbling through the sounds, but meaning every syllable. And when he finished, she kissed him so softly, he thought the world had stopped to listen. After that night, something in both of them steadied. The days grew longer again, light returning little by little to the edges of the city, and they found themselves talking about the future not as a fragile maybe, but as a series of plans that could actually happen. Sierra wanted to open a small practice someday, not in the heart of the city, but near its edge where the overlooked went first for help. Jace wanted to design machines that made life easier for those same neighborhoods, simpler, safer, cheaper to repair. He told her he'd handle the wiring if she handled the wounds. She laughed, saying that between the two of them, they might just fix more than either could alone. He said that sounded like a promise, and she answered, "It is." And though neither of them said it aloud, they both understood that love, for them, wasn't a story of rescue or transformation, but of recognition. He had seen her when others looked away. She had softened the edges of a man who thought steadiness meant solitude. Together, they'd made a home out of small, ordinary acts repeated until they became sacred. And when the last frost of winter cracked under the new sun, Jay stood in the doorway watching Sierra step into the morning light, her white fur blazing brighter than he'd ever seen it, and thought that maybe, just maybe, the world had finally learned to see her the way he always had. Spring came not with fanfare, but with the quiet insistence of life returning, a slow thawing that felt almost deliberate. The city softened around its edges, colors blooming between the cracks of old stone, and the air smelled faintly of renewal and metal dust from the workyards. In their apartment above the humming streets, Jace and Sierra adjusted to the new rhythm as easily as breathing. The radiator's hiss gave way to open windows and the occasional breeze that tangled her white hair around his shoulder when she leaned close. It had been months since she'd first arrived, frightened, apologetic, clutching her satchel like armor, and now she moved through their home with quiet confidence, tail loose and eyes bright, no longer measuring her worth by how little space she took up. Jace often caught himself watching her, not out of wonder anymore, but out of familiarity made sacred, the way a craftsman looks at a tool he's used so long it's become part of his hands. Every motion she made seemed to hum in time with his life, and he realized that peace could be noisy, too. The scrape of her claws on tile, the hum of her soft purrs when she worked, the gentle laughter that filled the small rooms like sunlight. The healer's hall called more often now, and Sierra began training others, her name whispered with genuine respect among apprentices who had once avoided her. There were still stares, still old prejudices that lingered like rust, but she had learned how to let them glance off without bruising. "You can't convince everyone," Jace told her once, after she came home from a long day, "but you don't need to. You just need to outlast them." She smiled and said that was an engineer's way of describing survival, and maybe he was right. Together they built a balance, his long shifts fixing the bones of the city, her steady hands tending to its pulse. And when they returned each evening, their lives folded into one another seamlessly, like two halves of a map that had been waiting for the other to make sense. One morning, while Sierra packed a basket of dried herbs for delivery to a nearby clinic, Jace came to her with a sheet of metal plans. The paper was smudged and folded, but the lines were clear, his design for a mobile field generator, a compact power source meant for healers' tents in poor districts. "It's not much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but it'll keep your instruments running when the grid cuts out. I want to test it at your clinic first." Sierra stared at the schematic, her golden eyes wide, and whispered, "You built this for me?" Jace shrugged, pretending nonchalance. "For us," he corrected. "Your patients shouldn't freeze when the power dies." She stepped closer, pressed her hand over his, and said softly, "You see me even when I forget to see myself. That's what love feels like." He didn't answer, just smiled, because sometimes silence said everything. That spring stretched into weeks of new beginnings. They spent weekends at the edge of the city, where the skyline gave way to low hills and forgotten pathways. Sierra collected wild herbs and told him their vulpine names, each one carrying a meaning that blended medicine with poetry. Herbs called things like dream's end and heart's rest, echo leaf, and promise root. Jace carved small marks into tree trunks along their route so they could find their way back, joking that it was his version of romance, leaving signs that said, "I was here with you." She told him it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said, because Vulpines didn't write love letters, they left trails. And so they did, marks in bark, stones stacked 3 high, feathers tied with thread. Everywhere they went, they left proof of their shared existence, subtle enough for the world to overlook, but real enough that if you followed the signs, you'd find a story written in silence and patience. When the Healers Guild invited Syrah to speak at a regional forum, an honor usually reserved for senior masters, she almost refused. The thought of standing before the same kind of council that had once rejected her made her fur prickle with old fear. Jace, standing in the kitchen doorway, just said, "Go show them what they almost lost." She laughed weakly and asked, "What if I stumble?" He answered, "Then stumble loudly so they can hear how far you've come." She went, and when she stood on that stage beneath the white banners of the guild, her voice trembled only at first. Then it grew stronger, steadier, as she spoke about care, about learning to listen before healing, about how kindness had no color, no hierarchy, no right to rank itself. Her speech was brief, but when she finished, the applause was real, not perfunctory, not polite, but warm. Afterward, an elder Vulpine with silver fur approached and said quietly, "We were wrong." That night, she came home to Jace with tear-streaked fur and a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. He didn't ask what had been said. He just pulled her close until her trembling stopped. They didn't chase perfection. Some days were still heavy. Jace sometimes came home with anger he couldn't explain, weighed down by the noise of the city and the fatigue of always fixing things that kept breaking. Syrah still had moments when she doubted herself, catching a glimpse of her reflection and remembering what she used to believe it meant. But they learned to navigate those moments together. One evening, when Jace came home wordless, she didn't ask what was wrong. She simply led him to the couch, sat behind him, and began combing her fingers through his hair the way he had once done for her, slow and rhythmic. "You taught me this," she whispered. "Now let me return it." His tension eased beneath her hands, and when he turned to face her, his eyes were softer. "You make me feel human again," he murmured. "You make me feel possible," she replied. It wasn't grand, but it was enough. Their apartment grew with them, not in space, but in feeling. The wooden box they had made together now held more than feathers and stones. It carried mementos of their shared life. A note scrawled during a power outage, a pressed blossom from their first walk outside the city, a metal washer from his workshop that she'd once mistaken for jewelry and worn on a chain. Each piece had its own heartbeat. When friends visited, they always commented that the place felt alive, and Jace would just smile, knowing the warmth came not from lamps or heat, but from her presence woven into every corner. On the windowsill, a small planter of herbs thrived. Her care, his design, soil, and circuitry mingled. On the wall hung a sketch she'd made of the two of them, him bent over a tool bench, her perched beside him, tails of smoke curling into hearts above their heads. It wasn't perfect art, but it was theirs. One late summer night, when the city glowed beneath them and the hum of traffic sounded like ocean waves, Syrah rested her head on his chest and said quietly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't opened your door that day?" He smiled against her hair. "You'd have found somewhere else eventually." She shook her head. "No, I think I would have kept waiting for a door that never opened." He kissed the top of her head. "Then I'm glad I was home." Silence followed, comfortable and full. Then she whispered, "You know what's strange? I used to hate my fur. I used to think it was proof that I'd been born wrong. But you look at me like it's the best thing you've ever seen." Jace's voice was quiet, firm. "Because it is. It's light that doesn't fade. And I've spent my whole life fixing things that lose their spark. You don't." She smiled, a slow, fragile thing that broke into laughter. "You're terrible at romance," she said. "I'm an engineer," he replied. "We build love, we don't decorate it." That made her laugh harder, and he joined in, both of them knowing that truth had never sounded so much like poetry. When autumn returned, they traveled to the mountains where Syrah's family had once lived, a pilgrimage she'd avoided for years. The forests there were quiet and endless, the trees marked with the old sigils of her people. She stood among them, tail still, ears low, and whispered, "I thought coming back would hurt more." Jace stood beside her, silent, letting her take as long as she needed. After a while, she reached for his hand and said, "I used to think I had to choose between my world and yours. But I think us, is both." He nodded, squeezing her fingers. "Then maybe that's what love is. Two worlds, one bridge." She smiled at that, eyes glistening. "You always have the right words." He shook his head. "No, I just listen to you long enough until I hear them." When they returned home, the city was alive with the first lights of the festival season. Fireworks reflected off glass towers, and laughter rolled through the streets. On their balcony, they watched from above, his arm around her shoulders, her head tucked under his chin. "You know," he said after a long silence, "they said a white fox couldn't be loved." She smiled, remembering those words like an echo finally fading. "Then they were wrong," she whispered. "Because I am." Her golden eyes met his, and for the first time, she believed it completely. The fireworks flared in colors neither of them had names for, and their reflections shone together in the window. Human and vulpine, metalworker and healer, light and warmth in equal measure. Inside, the wooden box still sat on the table, its lid slightly ajar, the faint scent of herbs rising from within. It wasn't a shrine or a memory chest. It was a living promise, a quiet record of everything they'd chosen to build. And as night folded around them, the hum of the city blended with her purr and his steady breath, the sound of two hearts that had learned to keep time together. The world would keep turning, indifferent and vast, but in that small apartment above the neon glow, the truth remained simple and unshakable. The white fox no one thought could be loved had found her home, and proved them all wrong.